Well, thanks very much for having me here. I just want to tell a little story too. I do have an Oklahoma connection, very vaguely. I have a friend called Andy Moore who worked with me in New Zealand very closely, and he had developed an online romance with a girl in Texas. And he went over to meet her on a 3-month visa, like I'm on. And the last day of the visa, he was due to come back and help me. He emailed me, he said, "Trevor, we're getting married." I said, "Oh, yeah, okay." He says, "But you have to wait 3 days to get married in Texas. So we're going to Oklahoma where you don't have to wait 1 day. You're the sooner state and you do things quickly." So they just had their first little boy about a month ago, Levi. So yeah, it was a very touching story, and that's my Oklahoma connection. Okay, so thanks for coming. I wanted to talk tonight about your president and the movement around him, but also a little bit about what you guys are doing. And as Don alluded to, a lot of people ask me, as a New Zealander, why I should care about the politics of your country. And there are two basic reasons. The first is simple gratitude. My country only remained free in World War II because of the huge sacrifice of American servicemen in the battles of Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea and Midway. Huge loss of life from your uncles and cousins and grandfathers saved my country. So there is a lot of gratitude for that. The second reason is related, it's a little more selfish. Ronald Reagan had it right. This is the last best hope of mankind.
Amen.
It is. No, if freedom fails in the United States, freedom will go everywhere. You know, a lot of Americans have emailed me and say, "Look, if Barack Obama gets back in again, can we come down and live in New Zealand?" Okay? And I say, "Yeah, come down for a holiday, it's great, you'll love it. You really will love it, but this is the front line. If freedom fails here, it goes everywhere." Now, down in the South Pacific, we're all very smug, we think nobody's going to hurt us. But 1,000 miles to the north of my country lies Fiji. It's now got a Marxist government. The Chinese are training the Fijian military and building big hydroelectric plants on the island. Fiji is now a Chinese client state. And that is a pattern right throughout the Pacific. Only a few weeks ago, the Australian Defence Minister was in China, and a top official of the Chinese Defence Department said to him, "Now is the time you choose to become do you want to stay under the protection of the United States or under our protection?" And that would not have happened under Ronald Reagan or George Bush or even Bill Clinton. And every ally of yours around the world is looking at the United States and its president and thinking, can we rely on this? Or do we have to make our own separate peace with the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians or whatever? And that's leading to a very dangerous and unstable situation right around the globe. So it's serious stuff. This doesn't just affect you guys. So I want to start basically talking about what I call the central secret of communism. You know, what is it really about? Is it atom bomb spies or Occupy rock throwers or labour union agitators? What it is, in my opinion, is the ability of a tiny Marxist-Leninist party to get their policies implemented as the law of the land in their native country. So how would that happen? You know, these parties are a few hundred strong, if that. How would they get their policies implemented as law in a Western democratic country? Could it possibly happen? Well, I want to give you an example of how it happened in my country, then lead into some examples in your country. In 1984, my country elected a socialist Labour government. And the very first thing they did was to enact legislation banning nuclear warships from our harbours. And as your country's nuclear warships were the only ones coming there, that destroyed the Australia, New Zealand, United States military alliance. A 30-year-old alliance was killed stone dead. the height of the Cold War, how come at the height of the Cold War would a Western country that loved America and had been saved by America only a few decades before turn its back on the Western alliance and hide its head in the sand? Why would we do that? Well, this is how it worked. A little bit after that, I spent a lot of time interviewing a New Zealander who had infiltrated the New Zealand Communist Party for our security intelligence services, the SIS, the equivalent of your FBI. And he worked his way up through the party, and in 1983 he was given the greatest honour any communist could enjoy. He was sent to Moscow with a small delegation to train at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning on Leningradsky Prospect. Now, this was a huge, huge organisation. There were 7,000 students there at any one time, many of them on 7-year courses, some of them with one-to-one tutelage. This was a training school for communist leaders for all over the world and future communist leaders. There were people from Sri Lanka and the Philippines and Denmark and Mexico and Canada and Taiwan and South Korea, Cambodia, Thailand, you name it. Virtually every country of the globe was represented except for one. That is the main enemy itself, the United States of America. And why were no Americans training in Moscow? Because at some point your government had told the Soviets that were any Americans caught training at that institute, there would be war. That is how seriously they took it. But what the Soviets used to do, they would train Mexicans or Canadians or New Zealanders in the doctrines they wanted promoted, then those people would go and train the American communists. So my friend sat down in a little room with the KGB, the other members of his delegation. They all had code names. They surrendered their passports. One of the leader of the delegation was Alan Weir, and they called him Alan Wolf. My friend was John Van de Ven, they called him John Van. So it's all secret squirrel stuff. And they sat down, and their idea was, this was the height of the Cold War, the time of the massive anti-nuclear marches through Europe, when Reagan was fighting the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, when NATO was in danger. There was a real danger of the breakup of NATO. So the idea was, the Soviets wanted to do that, but they wanted to pick on a small Western country and break them out of the Western alliance, in the hope that that would lead to a cascading effect and cause the collapse of NATO. So New Zealand was the obvious target. We were small, we were liberal, we were so-called world leaders in progressive change, and the communists were very strong. They controlled our labour unions, they had infiltrated our Labour Party, and they controlled the New Zealand peace movement through the New Zealand Council for World Peace. So they had a lot of assets there. So they thought, well, we can't sell this to New Zealanders as an anti-American thing, because New Zealanders love Americans. So we've got to get a new angle. So they worked out they were going to sell it as New Zealanders standing up for peace, New Zealanders proudly standing up against the nuclear arms race. This is patriotic New Zealanders forging their own course in the world. And they worked out all the slogans and all the psychology, and they had all the experts there to do it. And that little delegation went back to New Zealand and held secret meetings with the Labour Party. They even signed a contract. They had secret meetings with the Labour Union people and the peace movement and their journalist allies, etc. They started a big campaign, and in a few short months, that legislation was in front of the New Zealand Parliament, and it was signed off, and a nuclear alliance was kaput. Just like that. And I will tell you, if you ask any New Zealander today, any Kiwi as we call ourselves, about our anti-nuclear stand, which is still in force, they'll puff out their chest and say, yeah, we did that. We stood up against the nuclear arms race. We stood up for peace. And not one New Zealander in 100,000 has any idea that policy was designed by the KGB in Moscow in late 1983. That's how it works. Could this happen in your country? You know, the great anti-communist country of America. Give you a couple of examples. First one, out in California every year. Symbolic example. They have a Cesar Chavez holiday. Their day off work to celebrate the life of the great labour union leader Cesar Chavez, a man who was trained in Chicago by the Marxist agitator Saul Alinsky, a man who worked with communists and socialists his entire life and marched under the famous slogan, "Se se puede," yes we can. Heard that one before? And Obama openly acknowledges where he got it from. That holiday was organised by a woman called Evelina Alarcon. She was the leader of the Cesar Chavez holiday campaign. And she enlisted the support of a whole lot of left-wing movie stars, labour union leaders, and all her network of friends in the California state legislature. And she got that passed. Now she is trying to do it nationwide, and her website proudly lists the endorsement for that of Barack Obama. Evelina Alarcon is the leader of the Southern California Communist Party USA. So she is a hardcore Marxist-Leninist who got law changed in California, and if Obama gets back in again, she will take it nationwide. So that's just a symbolic example. But what about something more concrete, something that's going to affect every American? And that is, of course, Obamacare. Okay, it stands to socialise between 1/4 and 1/6 of your economy and change your lives forever. And I live in a country that's always had socialised medicine, and I'm telling you, you do not want it. Now, I acknowledge that Obamacare is not yet fully socialised medicine, but we all know where it's going to go if it's allowed to stand. And it cannot be allowed to stand. Amen. Cannot be. The father of the socialised healthcare movement in this country is a Chicago doctor, retired now, he's pushing 90. His name is Quentin Young. Quentin Young has promoted socialised or single-payer healthcare his entire working career, right since the 1950s. He set up numerous organisations, networks of doctors across the country, and several front organisations, Physicians for a National Health Plan and a whole lot of other groups, worked with state legislatures across the country and with several members of Congress, including John Conyers. And they have got single-payer legislation in front of your Congress several times, but it's always failed. But in 2008, when Barack Obama got in, it started to move forward, and you have what you have now. It is no accident that it moved forward under Mr. Obama, because for many years, Quentin Young was Barack Obama's personal physician. More than that, he has openly stated that he indoctrinated Obama into the ideas of socialised medicine. Further than that, Quentin Young is a 40-year veteran of the Communist Party USA until he left that organisation to set up a new Marxist group called Democratic Socialists of America. And DSA, who Obama has always been close to, despite its moderate-sounding name, has one of its leaders currently in jail in this country as a Soviet and East German spy. A guy called Kurt Stand. So that tells you what DSA is all about. Incidentally, the man who engineered Romney Care in Massachusetts and engineered the affordable health care, basically wrote the affordable health care bill, is a former Massachusetts state senator named John McDonough, also a member of Democratic Socialists of America. So they work both sides of the aisle. So don't ever let me tell you that anybody tell you that one man can't change the world, because Quentin Young is on the verge of changing your country forever, and by extension the whole planet, if he is allowed to get away with the scam. The mechanics of it are quite simple really, is that since 1995, when John Sweeney took over as head of the AFL-CIO, Sweeney is a Marxist, member of Democratic Socialists of America, and he took away the anti-communist clause out of the AFL-CIO's constitution, and the Marxists have flooded back and now control every major labour union in this country. ASCII, SEIU, NEA, you name it, they own it. So the Marxists set a policy, they give it to the labour unions and make it labour union policy. The labour unions go out and get Democrats elected, and there's hardly a Democrat in this country that wasn't elected with labour union help and money. He who pays the piper calls the tune. They get you elected, they tell you what policies to promote, they tell you who to vote for, etc. So the communists set the policy, give it to the labour unions give it to the Democrats, and the Democrats stand up on the floor of your state legislature or your Congress and promote a certain policy as theirs. But it came from the communists. And that is how small groups of Marxists can change policy at the state level, the county level, and the national level, and they do it all the time. So Mr. Obama himself, a lot of people say to me, Barack Obama made a great movement, but I'll say to you, a movement made Barack Obama. Okay? That movement started in Chicago in the early 1950s when a bunch of communists and socialists stopped fighting and decided they wanted to form an alliance to take on the corrupt, daily democratic machine that ran Chicago for decades. So it was basically communists fighting gangsters. So what did they do? They knew they couldn't take on the big machine without a lot of allies. So the communists and the socialists of Hyde Park in South Chicago, the leafy, lovely area around the University of Chicago, in the middle of the industrial wasteland of South Chicago, formed an alliance, and they joined up with the local Latino population, the black population, and the labour unions. So communists, socialists, Latinos, blacks, labour unions. Does any of that sound familiar? So that's where it started. The first person they got elected was a man called Leon Dupre to the Chicago City Council. Leon Dupre, in his later years, was a mentor to Barack Obama. But in his early years, in the 1920s, he used to go to the local rifle range in Chicago with his best friend Saul Alinsky, where they practiced rifle shooting for the communist revolution they believed was just around the corner. In the 1940s, Mr. Dupre was going down to Mexico City to visit with Leon Trotsky, the exiled Soviet leader then hiding out from Stalin, until Stalin caught up with them. So, buried the hatchet, buried the ice axe, I think it was. So, the next person they got elected was in 1983. They got Harold Washington, a black lawyer, elected as mayor of Chicago. He had a communist front and socialist record going back for decades, and he stacked his administration from top to bottom with Marxists. Absolutely stacked it. He died in 1987, and the Dailies took over again. But in 1992, this movement elected Carol Moseley Brown to the US Senate from Illinois. She also had long communist and socialist affiliations, but she was also very corrupt. She only lasted one term, they turned her out, and dear old Bill Clinton, as a favour, gave her an ambassadorship to guess where? New Zealand. So thanks, Mr. Clinton. It was a great honour. The next person they elected was, of course, Barack Obama. And I get criticised for calling him Barack Obama. It's Barack Obama. And elected to the Illinois State Senate in 1996. Elected to the US Senate in 2004. And by using their networks nationwide, in 2008, they put him in the White House. And he who pays the piper calls the tune. Barack Obama knows who put him there, and he's been working, acting out the socialist agenda every day of his presidency. If you want to know what the Democrats and Barack Obama are going to do tomorrow, read the Communist Party USA's People's World Today or Democratic Socialists of America's Democratic Left. You read those publications today, and that's what the Democrats will be doing tomorrow. That's how it works. So why is Mr. Obama so keen to fall in line? Why does he want to work with these crazed old dinosaur Marxists? You know, what's in it for him? Well, the fact is he's always worked with them. He doesn't know anything else. His entire life he's worked with them. The most significant mentor to Barack Obama in his younger days was a man called Frank Marshall Davis. Now, Frank Marshall Davis was, in the 1940s in Chicago, was a black journalist, poet, writer, and a leading member of the Communist Party USA. But he was very well up and very influential in the Chicago left, which was a very vibrant movement right there at the height of the Jazz Age. And Frank Marshall Davis even used to teach jazz courses at the Communist Party school in Chicago. But in 1948, he left all the glamour and glitz behind and moved out to a little backwater in the Pacific. And Hawaii was a backwater in those days before the tourist trade and statehood. Why would he do that? At the time, Stalin had ordered the US Communist Party to put as many comrades out into the islands as they could, because that's where Pearl Harbor is. And they wanted as many spies on the island as they could get to monitor activities there, and as many agitators as they could get to close the bases down. Because the communists have always backed what they call the peace movement. And that peace movement has always been aimed 100% at your military. Because your military is what stands in their way. So Frank Marshall Davis goes out to Hawaii. Oh, the other thing they were doing, they were anticipating statehood. Because they knew that when Hawaii became a state, and if they could take over the local Democrat Party, which they did, that would guarantee them 2 more left-wing senators and a whole bunch of left-wing congressmen in your government forever. And it would make it easier to keep Republicans marginalised. That is the exact reason why the communists have always supported the DC statehood movement, and why today they support the Puerto Rican statehood movement. It's nothing to do with the rights of Puerto Ricans, it's just getting more leftists into your House and Senate to keep you people out of government. That's what it's all about. So in Hawaii, Frank Marshall Davis, he worked for a labour union publication. He infiltrated the Democrat Party, he did all the things he's meant to do. But he also worked for a publication, a labour union publication called the Honolulu Record. And he wrote, his boss was a man called Koji Ariyoshi. He was a Communist Party member who had worked in China with the US Army with Mao Zedong's communist forces against the Japanese Imperial Army in World War II. After the war, Koji Ariyoshi went to New York, where he worked with the Amerasia people. Now, Amerasia was a magazine staffed by communists and several known Soviet spies who worked with your State Department to tilt US foreign policy away from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist pro-American Chinese towards Mao Zedong's communist pro-Soviet Chinese. And because they succeeded, China was delivered to the communists. Small bunch of traitors, your government basically gave China to the communists. We're feeling the effects of that today. So, Frank Marshall Davis also was of interest to the FBI, and they watched him for 19 years. 19 years they watched him, and they put him on the security index, and that was only reserved for the top level communists. They put him on the security index. That meant if war had ever broken out with the Soviet Union, he would have been arrested that day. Because they had reports that Frank Marshall Davis was going around obscure beaches in Hawaii, photographing them with telephoto lenses. And I think they suspected espionage because, you know, they wanted to know the lie of the land. The Soviets needed to know exactly what Hawaii, you know, the topography of Hawaii. So he was a marked man. He was considered a very dangerous individual. Now, a lot of people, about 1970, Frank Marshall Davis was introduced to the 10 or 11-year-old Barack Obama by his maternal grandfather because they wanted a black role model, because he's a young black guy on an island with hardly any black people, and they wanted a role model, a father figure for the man. Frank Marshall Davis was mentioned 22 times in Barack Obama's dreams for his father, but always as Frank. never as Frank Marshall Davis, because he was said to be, everybody else got their full name, but Frank, who was a notorious communist, was only named as Frank. But 22 times indicates there was something significant about that relationship. Now this is the man, by the way, who used to write poems praising Stalin's Red Army. Poems praising Stalin, and poems, criticising massively KKK, racist America. And he had your president's ear for 9 or 10 years at his most formative stage of life. But some liberals will say to me, they'll say, oh yeah, but look, by that time Frank Marshall Davis was just a dope-smoking old alcoholic. No big deal, it was all the communist days were way behind him. But as late as 1979, the year that Obama left for California, Frank Marshall Davis was still listed as an endorser of the American Committee for the Protection of Foreign Law, the Communist Party USA's leading front of the time. So there's no evidence that Frank Marshall Davis ever ceased being read. And just incidentally, 2 names under Frank Marshall Davis's on that list. There's another guy called Hugh DeLacy. So please remember that for later in the talk. So Obama leaves Hawaii, goes to California, to Occidental College in Los Angeles, where he mixed with Tom Hayden's radical crowd and the Democratic Socialist Alliance people. Then he went to Columbia University in New York, and there he attended at least one and possibly two of the annual Socialist Scholars Conferences that were then organised by DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. And these weren't little phone box events. These were 2,000 to 3,000 people, Black Panther radicals, Marxists, feminists, gay activists, you name it. 2,000 or 3,000 people gathered in a hall, plotting how to bring your country to its knees, and Barack Obama was right in the middle of it. So then Obama goes out to Chicago, and the reason he gives for moving to Chicago is he was inspired by the election of Harold Washington, the Marxist mayor of Chicago. He even applied for a job in Washington's administration. He didn't get that, but he still moved to Chicago. He worked with Acorn and the radicals of South Chicago. Then he decided to move out to go to Harvard, get a law degree, obviously with an eye to politics. So he goes there, mixes with the Marxists at Harvard, pro-Cuban radicals, etc. Goes back to Hawaii, goes back to Chicago, sets his sights on a political career. For several years, he worked with a woman in Chicago. She gave him his first job in politics. Her name was Alice Palmer. Alice Palmer employed Barack Obama as her chief of staff because her idea was, she was an Illinois state senator. She decided to run for Congress as a Democrat. And she said, well, I'm going for Congress, Barack. You can have my state Senate seat. So she introduced him to all the people in Chicago that he had to know, fundraisers, labour union people. She was the woman who took Barack Obama to the famous meeting in the drawing room of Weather Underground terrorists Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn. Quentin Young, the doctor, was there as well. That was Obama's introduction to the Hyde Park left. But Alice Palmer fell out with Barack Obama because she didn't win her congressional primary. And she said, well, no, I want my Senate seat back now. And Obama said, no, sorry, Alice. And they had a bit of a falling out. And Barack Obama got her signatures challenged and got her knocked off the ballot, as he got all the other 3 candidates knocked off the ballot, and he won unopposed. Playing hardball. So that's what he did. But Alice Palmer, who was with your president for at least 3 years, working with him very closely, and fair to say, got him his first job in politics, had a bit of a history. In 1980, Alice Palmer and her husband were invited to Grenada in the Caribbean to celebrate the first anniversary of that country's communist revolution by the Marxist-Leninist dictator of that island, Maurice Bishop. And the invitation cards are in my book. Maurice Bishop was later murdered by his own comrades is the more extreme comrades, and in 1983 Ronald Reagan sent troops onto the island to basically shut down what was going to become a second Cuba. And my friend was training in Moscow when that happened, and I'll tell you, the Soviets were absolutely spewing what Ronald Reagan had done. So we can thank President Reagan for that, definitely. So in 1983, the same year, Alice Palmer went to Prague in communist Czechoslovakia for a meeting of the Soviet Front World Peace Council. And this peace thing will come up all the time. The World Peace Council was the Soviets' main front. It had international affiliations in every country, including the New Zealand Work Council for World Peace in my country, who orchestrated our anti-nuclear stand, and the US Peace Council in your country, run by Communist Party USA members. Alice Palmer served on the executive of the US Peace Council with at least 16 Communist Party USA members, and Barbara Lee, who is now a congresswoman out of California, a Democrat and one of Barack Obama's earliest and most vocal supporters. So just remember that Peace Council, its whole goal was to destroy NATO, to campaign against US military spending, to campaign for spending cuts in the United States, to campaign against the Western Alliance and any military thing that could stand in the Soviets' way. That was its whole goal, and it was controlled by the KGB and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union International Department. Alice Palmer was also the leader of the Black Press Institute out of Chicago, which was a nationwide and international network. It had a top man from the Palestine Liberation Organization involved in it. And it was a network of black communists, all over communist journalists, whose job was to basically sow Soviet disinformation and propaganda amongst your country's black population. In 1985, she took 16 of these people to the Soviet Union, East Germany and Czechoslovakia, where they met with the editor of Pravda and senior officials of the Soviet government and senior officials of the Czech and East German governments. In 1986, Alice Palmer covered that year's annual conference of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in Moscow. The same year, she was elected as North American Vice President of the International Organization of Journalists, another bona fide Soviet front whose job was to influence journalists all over the world. Alice Palmer's responsibility was to monitor activities in Canada, the United States, the Caribbean and Mexico. And her job also involved implementing what they used to call their new information order, a very sinister sounding phrase, which was all to do with what they called issues of media fairness. Media fairness. Now, who remembers the fairness doctrine? Guess where it probably came from? The fairness doctrine was the idea that if you had a radio station and you put a conservative talkback host on for 2 hours in the afternoon, you had to give equal time to a liberal. Because it wasn't fair that the conservatives would get an audience and sponsorship and money, and the poor dumb liberal sap would get none of either. As if there wasn't enough liberal media already. And it was only when Reagan abolished that fairness doctrine that conservative talkback became economic, and you had the flowering of the Rush Limbaughs and the Sean Hannitys and the education that I'm sure a lot of you people have got over the years. And you wonder why Mr. Obama wants to reintroduce some sort of fairness doctrine and some sort of net neutrality, as he calls it, for the internet. Could it be that he wants to shut your voices down?
Sure. Yes.
Surely not. That's where you've got to watch. And this is where these kind of things come from. Fairness doctrine, media fairness, Alice Palmer, Soviet Union. This is how this works. So to put it very bluntly, Alice Palmer was a high-level Soviet operative involved with at least 2 major Soviet fronts and with close relationships over many years to 3 Soviet bloc governments at the highest levels, and this is the woman who gave your president his first job in politics. Frank Marshall Davis, mentor; Alice Palmer, enabler. Slight bit of a pattern forming there. What about today? And I could list many people like that, but today I'll talk about two people who influenced Obama right now. The first one I'll talk about, because you're judged by the company you keep, and I'm very, very proud to be judged by the company here, I have to say. Very proud. Talk about the other half of Obama's brain, and even the Liberals call it this, and that's Valerie Jarrett. Okay? Valerie Jarrett introduced Obama to his wife, fundraised for him, and smoothed his path through Chicago politics. She now sits in the White House with Obama as his most trusted friend and advisor. There's nothing Barack Obama would not share with Valerie Jarrett, and she was regarded as the most powerful woman in the White House, possibly the most powerful person in the White House. What about Valerie Jarrett's pedigree? Where does she come from? Valerie Jarrett's mother is Barbara Bowman. She's a child psychologist from Chicago. She runs the Erickson Institute, which has had a lot of influence on early childhood education in your country. In 2009, she was given an award for her work by the President himself, and that ceremony was prominently featured in the pages of the Communist Party USA's People's World. The Erickson Institute is named after Erik Erikson, a disciple of Sigmund Freud, psychologist, who remembers the phrase identity crisis. He's having an identity crisis. That was Erik Erikson. Okay? Erik Erikson was expelled from Berkeley University in the 1940s because he refused to sign an anti-communist loyalty oath. He was also a lecturer at the California Labour School, the Communist Party USA's trade union school at the time. On the board of the Erickson Institute have served Tom Ayers, the father of Bill Ayers, the Weather Underground terrorist, and Bernadine Dawn, the wife of Bill Ayers and a famous terrorist in her own right. On Valerie Jarrett's maternal grandfather was Robert Taylor. In the 1940s, he was involved with the American Peace Mobilization, which was the Communist Party USA's major front at the time. Its job was to keep the US out of the war, to stop the US going to help Britain. Because they, at that time, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were allies. But the minute, they were helping the Nazis. But the minute the Nazis betrayed the Soviets and attacked the Soviet Union, they changed the name to American People's Mobilization, and were the mass big pro-war campaigners. It was a major communist front. Robert Taylor was involved, and there he worked with Frank Marshall Davis. On the other side of Valerie Jarrett's family, her late father-in-law was Vernon Jarrett, a very prominent Chicago journalist, a black guy. The last thing he did when he was dying of cancer in 2004 was to issue a call from his deathbed to the black population of Chicago to get out and vote for Barack Obama in that year's Senate primaries. Go back to 1946. At that time, Vernon Jarrett was serving on the Illinois State Executive of American Youth for Democracy. A wonderful sounding organisation. I'm sure you'd all like your children to belong to it. Except it was the youth wing of Communist Party USA. 2 years later, Vernon Jarrett was serving on the publicity committee of the Packing House Workers Strike Committee. Packing House Workers were a communist-controlled labour union. They were on strike, and Vernon Jarrett was writing their press releases and propaganda. On that publicity committee, with Vernon Jarrett, also served Frank Marshall Davis. So isn't it coincidental that these two people running your country from the White House can both trace their political ancestry back to the Communist Party USA of 1940 Chicago? Both of them. Okay, we'll look at the other half of Barack Obama's brain, which doesn't leave very much, really. There's dear old David Axelrod, Mr. Axelrod, the man who took Barack Obama, an untried senator with a funny-sounding Muslim name, up against Hillary Clinton and beat her. And it's no mean feat. David Axelrod has a reputation, and this is how he wins his elections, and this is what he's doing right now as he's running your president's campaign out of Chicago. As an e-camper, he wins elections by blackening the name of his opponents, which is why Mr. Romney has to put up with all the Bain Capital stuff and the gay haircut scandal and all this kind of thing. Negative campaigning, because they got very little positive to run with, and that's how Mr. Axelrod runs his campaigns. But what about his pedigree? Where did he come from? Where did he learn his tricks? In the early 70s, David Axelrod moved from New York, where he came from a very far-left family, to Chicago to study political science at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park, and he was picked up and mentored for several years by two prominent journalists/activists, Don Rose and David S. Cantor. These guys got him his first job in the Chicago Tribune. They worked together on several political campaigns, including the Carol Mosley Brown campaign and Harold Washington's second campaign. They were very close for several years, and these guys mentored Mr. Axelrod. Before they picked him up, they had a publication in Hyde Park, Chicago for several years called the Hyde Park Kenwood Voices, and it was the voice of the Hyde Park left. It ran articles about Quentin Young's trip to North Vietnam during the Vietnam War to give aid to the communists, about his son Ethan's trip to Cuba to cut sugarcane for Castro. It covered the SDS riots in Chicago in 1968 on the side of the rioters, and had a regular column by a Chicago congressman called Abner Mikva. Mikva was very much part of their organisation. Mikva was a militant opponent in Congress of your Second Amendment. He campaigned relentlessly against gun rights. When he left Congress, he was a law professor, and he openly became close to Democratic Socialists of America, open supporter of them. He also became a mentor at the Chicago Law School of Barack Obama, a mentor for many years. He was also the mentor to another American legal person you will all know, and that is Elena Kagan, who now serves on your Supreme Court. Very incestuous, this thing. Very incestuous. So, Don Rose, one half of this little partnership, the Communist Front is since the 1940s. The Chicago Red Squad file identifies him as a dangerous anarchist. He was an executive member for many years of the Chicago Committee to Defend the Bill of Rights, another wonderful sounding organisation which was the Communist Party's major front in Chicago and still exists. On the executive with Don Rose served Quentin Young, Obama's future doctor. The other half of the partnership, David S. Cantor. His father was Harry Cantor, the leader in the 1930s of the Massachusetts Communist Party. He was jailed for a year for sedition in 1931, and after he got out of jail, he took the whole family, including baby David, to the Soviet Union, where they lived for 5 years in the 1930s. And Harry Cantor was so well thought of by the Soviets, he was given the job of translating Lenin's works into English. That's not something any communist would get. So by 1937, they were back in the United States. By the early 1940s, mid-1940s, they were living in Chicago. And Harry Cantor bought a little magazine in 1948 in Chicago called the Chicago Star. And that was a Communist Party publication, and he bought it off Frank Marshall Davis. David Cantor was a Communist Party member. He edited the student newspaper, Chicago Maroon. 1960, David Cantor was still a communist, and he was working with another communist guy called Leroy Wolins, who later went on to found Veterans for Peace, yet another anti-military Communist Party front. These two guys ran a little publication company called Trans World Publications, and its job was to distribute Soviet and Russian literature all over your country. and was paid a regular subsidy by the Soviet embassy in Washington to do that. The two men were actually required by your government to register formally as agents of the Soviet Union. So we go forward to 1964. And who here remembers, if you dare to admit it, that year's presidential race between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater? Okay? It was a big race and a very pivotal race in the history of this country. Because Lyndon Johnson, the Democrat, won. And we got the Great Society, the biggest expansion of welfare and government power in this country since the New Deal. The thing that put millions of black families and poor white families in this country on welfare and destroyed untold families and impoverished this country tremendously. Barry Goldwater, on the other hand, was a principled conservative. He was Ronald Reagan before there was Ronald Reagan. And he was a real constitutionalist. He would have loved the Tea Party, and the Tea Party would have loved him. He was a really good man. And had he won that election, I guarantee you that this country would be a lot richer and a lot happier and a lot more stable today. But he didn't win. The Democrat won. And one of the main reasons Barry Goldwater lost, because he was viciously vilified in the press of this country as a racist, a fascist and an extremist. Has anybody here heard those terms in recent times? Slightly familiar to you all? Yep. And they came from the same source. Because one of the main sources of the vilification of Barry Goldwater was Trans World Publications out of Chicago. The communist-run, Soviet-subsidised publication company. So your Mr. Axelrod, who's now trying to get your president re-elected, learned his trade at the hands of a Soviet-paid professional black propagandist. That's where he learned his tricks. So that brings me to what I consider the real agenda of the left. What are they trying to do here? Why do they get up every day to their Labour Union offices or their Acorn office or whatever, their Democrat Party headquarters? Why do they do it? What motivates them? Are they trying to make you like France? Is that all it is that some people will tell you? Eating croissants all day and manufacturing white flags? No. Sorry, Elaine. Sorry, down the back there. I apologise for that. It was pretty low blow, really. So, look, I think it's more than that. And I want to explain what I think it is. But before I do so, I want to build up a little bit of credibility for an Albuquerque retired high school math teacher named Mark Rudd. Now, why would I want to do that? Mark Rudd was the brains of the Weather Underground terrorist organisation. He was right up there in the top leadership with Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn. In 1968, Mark Rudd led the STS riots at Columbia University, which made headlines around the world. In 1969, he was in Cuba training under a KGB major. In 2006, Mark Rudd got together, came out of retirement and got together with Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dawn, Jeff Jones, another terrorist Weather Underground leader who incidentally helped write Obama's stimulus package, Tom Hayden, and Angela Davis. I'm sure you're all familiar with Angela Davis, and David Graeber, one of the key founders of the Occupy movement, and a whole bunch of communists and Marxists, and they set up a new organisation called Movement for a Democratic Society. Don't they love these noble-sounding names? Movement for a Democratic Society was the adult support group for the new Students for a Democratic Society, the new SDS, which is active on college campuses across your country. These were the people that created Merry Hell at the Republican Party convention in Minneapolis a few years ago. In 2008, MDS set up a subsidiary organisation and they called it Progressives for Obama. And that was designed to unite the left behind their candidate. And Mark Rudd endorsed Progressives for Obama. So what I'm trying to say here is that Mark Rudd is a key man on the left, and he personally knows several people who have worked with Obama over a period of several years. So when Mark Rudd predicts Obama's agenda and says where he is going to take this country, I give him some credibility. I will listen to him. Now, in November 2008, just after the election, Barack Obama, President-elect Obama, appointed some conservatives to positions in the defence establishment. And some people on our side of the fence went, thank God for that, you know, maybe he's not such a crazy man after all. Maybe he's going to play to the centre and not be a radical. Maybe all this terrorist stuff is so much bunkum. But the left were spewing. And Mark Rudd's inbox was filling up with letters, emails from irate comrades all over the country. What is the president we got elected doing, putting conservatives into the hated military-industrial complex? And they were agitated. And Mark Rudd knew he had to settle the comrades down, to get them back on board with the agenda, calm them down, said, you know, get back with the plan. So he wrote a little article for the Rag blog out of Austin, Texas, very widely read on the left, run by weathermen, former SDSs and a whole bunch of people with connections to Cuba. And he wrote a little article to calm the comrades down, to get them back on board. And I'm going to quote some pieces from it because I think it's quite relevant. It's the Rag blog, November 28th, 2008, just a few days after the election, and you can still online. Obama is a very strategic thinker. He knew precisely what it would take to get elected, and he didn't blow it. He knew he had to play to the centre to not be run over by the press, Republicans, or the media, or scare centrist voters away. So he has a narrow mandate for change. The economic agenda will stress stimulation from the bottom sometimes and handouts to the top at other times. Is that what he's done? So how would an Albuquerque high school math teacher know that? On foreign policy and the wars and the use of the military, there will be no change at all. And never threaten the military budget. That will unite a huge majority of Congress against him. And I agree with this strategy. Leave the military alone because they are way too powerful for now. By the second or third year of this recession, people may begin to discuss cutting the military budget. So where are we now, ladies and gentlemen? 3 years in, right? You're all worried 4 years in now. You're all worried about your jobs, your businesses, keeping the IRS off your back, keeping your kids in college. America is focused on the economic issues. And who can blame you? But while you're looking at that, what is smiling Leon Panetta doing over at your Defence Department right now? What is your Secretary of Defence doing to your military? Slashing. Why is 20% of the federal budget taking 50% of the cuts? Minimum. Why is Mr. Obama talking about cutting the US nuclear deterrent down to 300 nukes when the Russians have got thousands of them and the best civil defence system in the world? Why is Mr. Obama on hot mic in Japan and Korea talking to Dmitry Medvedev, the Russian president? Why is he saying, when I get re-elected, I'll have more flexibility to deal with you? And why is Mr. Medvedev saying, yes, I understand. I will pass that on to Vladimir. We are with you. What is he with him on? What was Alice Palmer trying to do for years? Why have the Soviets and the Cubans been funding your peace movement for decades? The movement aimed at destroying your military. Who stands to benefit if you slash your military to ribbons? Could it be the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians? Who's going to stand up to them if you don't? Canada? Taiwan, New Zealand, Iceland. That is the agenda of the left. That is what the left has wanted from day one. That is what they've been agitating more for than anything else, because your military and your ability to fund it as the only thing that stands between the Russians and the Chinese and all their crazy allies carving up the world amongst themselves. The only thing. And now they've got a president in the White House who has been connected to these sort of people for decades, who's doing exactly what they want. Now this is serious, this has international implications, because you guys can, this is not about depression, because you guys can survive a depression. This is not about losing some of your freedoms, because you're Americans, you'll stand up and take them back. But have you ever been in the position before when your chief executive is destroying your means of defending not only your allies, but your own country? Well, you look, I'll talk about that later, man. But you look at this. The world is coming in. Asia, the Russians are getting more aggressive. The Chinese are building a blue water navy. The Iranians are going crazy. They're all allied in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Russia, China and Iran aren't separate entities. They're all working together in one organization. Europe's on the verge of collapse. Your economy is teetering. The world is going towards its greatest potential period of instability since World War II, and this is the time your president wants to cut your military. And you're letting him do it because you're worried about surviving. So, basically you're going to be, if this carries on, you'll be faced with a choice. You're incorporated into some sort of United Nations world government, or you face the combined might of your enemies and the possibility that your country will be reduced to a pile of ashes. That's really what you're facing. Told you I wouldn't pull any punches. Okay. So Mark Rudd went on to say, was it finished? Obama plays basketball. I'm not much of an athlete, I barely know the game. But one thing I do know is you have to be able to look like you're doing one thing, but do another. Yeah. That is why all these conservative appointments are important. The strategy is to feint right, move left. Any other strategy would invite sure defeat. Now, isn't that an admission that your president scammed his way into the White House by pretending to be a moderate, but his agenda, even though he might feint right, his agenda has always been left, and he's got your military firmly in his sights. That's his number one priority. Now that brings me to smiling Leon himself. Leon Panetta voted in 100-0 through the US Senate. A very well liked, affable, amiable man, loved on both sides of the aisle, the man who got Osama bin Laden. Leon Panetta, what about his history? Leon Panetta was a Democratic congressman out of Santa Cruz, California for many years. Now the Santa Cruz Democrat Party isn't the same as the Idaho Democrat Party, or the Missouri Democrat Party, or the Oklahoma Democrat Party. It is the far-left, lunatic fringe, nutcase, communist California Democrat Party. That's where he came from. Leon Panetta worked with Democratic Socialists of America Marxists. He campaigned, as did the Communist Party USA, to get Leonard Peltier from North Dakota released from jail. Leonard Peltier was an American Indian activist who murdered in cold blood 2 FBI agents, and Leon Panetta campaigned with the communists to get him out of the slammer. Leon Panetta spent most of his time in Congress agitating against Star Wars, agitating against Reagan's policies of containing communism in Latin America, and agitating against US defence spending. That's what he did. His record is there for anyone to see. He was a left-wing, anti-military Democrat. And when he was in the Clinton White House, he was their budget director. He's a budget man with a smiling face who hates the military, whose job is to gut your military while keeping the Republicans and the public on side. That's his job. But Leon Panetta also had a friend in Santa Cruz. Leon and Sylvia Panetta were best friends with Hugh and Dorothy DeLacy. Remember that name, Hugh DeLacy? American Committee for the Protection of Foreign Born with Frank Marshall Davis. Hugh and Dorothy DeLacy were buddies, you know. The couples were buddies. They had parties at each other's houses. When Hugh DeLacy died in 1986, Leon Panetta read the eulogy at his funeral alongside 3 members of Democratic Socialists of America, 3 Marxists and Leon Panetta. Hugh DeLacy and Leon Panetta shared a series of letters over 9 or 10 years, which I have, all of which dealt with how terrible Reagan was for opposing the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, how terrible Star Wars was, and how US defence expenditure had to be reined in. That's what they were talking about. Leon Panetta had to have known, or should have known, that Hugh DeLacy was going down to Nicaragua to visit with those Sandinistas, and was also going to Spain to visit with the Spanish Communist Party. Hugh DeLacy had a bit of a history. From 1946 to 1948, he was a Democrat congressman out of Seattle. And that was the time they used to talk about the 47 states of the Union and the Soviet of Washington. The communists ran Washington state at that time through the labour unions. And all his time in Congress, Hugh DeLacy was known for his agitation to get the United States to abandon Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese and support Mao Zedong's communist Chinese. That's what he was known for. And that's not surprising, because all the time he was a Democrat congressman, Hugh DeLacy was a secret, card-carrying member of the Communist Party USA. And he maintained that party membership at least until the late 1960s, and after that he became close to Democratic Socialists of America and other Marxist groups. The devil looks after his own. In 1975, Hugh DeLacy was contacted by an old friend from the 1940s who had worked with him on Chinese issues, and that was a Stanford University academic called John Stuart Service. John Stuart Service was a former member of the Soviet-sponsored Amerasia spy ring that gave China to the communists. He arranged for DeLacy, Hugh and Dorothy DeLacy, for a month-long, all-expenses-paid trip to communist China in 1975. So DeLacy goes to China, the DeLacy's go to China, they visit the factory farms, the collective farms, and, and all that sort of thing. They watch the little kids wave the red flags. But they also had time to visit with 2 American expatriates in China. The first one was Frank Coe, who was then working as a propagandist for the Communist Chinese government. Frank Coe was a former member of the Amerasia Soviet spy ring. The other guy that was visited with was Solomon Adler. Solomon Adler was another former member of the Amerasia spy ring, and at that time was a serving advisor to the Chinese intelligence services. He was a live Chinese spy when Hugh DeLacy was visiting him in China. Back in the United States, they kept corresponding for some time, but back in the United States, Hugh DeLacy was also corresponding with Don Wheeler, a Communist Party member out of Washington State, a former member of the Silver Master KGB spy ring of Washington of the 1940s. He was also corresponding with Victor Perlow, another communist out of Connecticut, another former member of the Silver Master KGB spy ring. So this best friend of your current Secretary of Defence personally knew 4 former Soviet spies, one of whom was a live Chinese agent. Now I ask you, if Mr. Panetta applied today for a job cleaning the latrines at your local military base, would he pass an FBI security clearance? No. I ask you. Back in Chicago, Hugh DeLacy was also the West Coast agent for a magazine called In These Times. There was a socialist journal based out of Chicago. It was run by a man called James Weinstein. James Weinstein was a former Communist Party member, founder of Democratic Socialists of America, and allegedly, reportedly, peripherally involved in the Rosenberg spy ring of the 1940s, the people who gave Stalin the A-bomb secrets. In 2002, James Weinstein and several other Chicago communists, who later, they got together and set up a big anti-Iraq war rally in Federal Plaza in downtown Chicago. They got a whole lot of activists together and they made all the speeches, and one man used that venue to make his name nationwide as an opponent, to put himself on the stage nationwide as an opponent of the Iraq war, and that was, guess who? Barack Obama. So I repeat my claim. Barack Obama didn't make a movement made Barack Obama. And it's a very incestuous movement, and several people associated with it do not owe their allegiance to your country, to put it mildly. So that is how Barack Obama got elected and why he's promoting Marxists at every opportunity to positions of power ever since. But I don't want to depress you people with all of that. But a little bit late. I really don't, because you Tea Party folk, you 912ers, you want the truth. Because, as they say, the truth shall set you free. Only when you know the problem can you solve the problem. And you have to know the implications and how deep this thing goes. What you're actually fighting. They're not trying to make you like France, I'll tell you that. So, I'm here because in 2008, if I thought there was no hope for this country, I'd be back in New Zealand right now building bunkers. I'll tell you. Okay? But in 2008, the left thought they had a slam dunk. They had the House, they had the Senate, and they had the White House. And their agenda was all primed and ready to roll. It was all worked out, and they were going to steamroll Middle America out of existence once and for all. They were going to take this country down. But in 2009 and 2010, you people here, and hundreds of thousands like you around this country, you stood on your Constitution, you rediscovered American exceptionalism, and you marched, and you agitated, and you emailed, and you campaigned, and you worked, and you stopped the left dead in its tracks. They hate you for it, which is why I love you for it. You know, you people stopped card check, you stopped cap and trade, you slowed down and watered down Obamacare, you stalled the left stone dead, stone cold, and they didn't see it coming. And I've got to confess, neither did I. I really didn't. If you told me there'd be a movement like you guys are part of 5 years ago, I would have laughed. But you Americans stood up and you gave your country a second chance. You gave your country breathing space. Because this doesn't end the year of 2012 either. Because I see this as the second American Revolution. This is 1773 of the second American Revolution. And that revolution took 12, 15 years. It wasn't all fighting. It was the preliminary stage, the fighting, and the battles that went on afterwards to formulate the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and work out the system. So this is 1773. And you think how hard they had it back then. A bunch of farmers and shopkeepers and lawyers and fishermen and seamstresses. You know, in those days, 40% of the country supported the British. 20%, if that, supported the revolution, and all the rest didn't care. But those few people, united by an ideal of liberty and constitutional government and opposition to tyranny, got together and took on the greatest empire the world had ever known and bloody well beat them. And how miraculous is that? Would you have bet on the revolutionaries back in 1776? You'd be crazy if you did. But they won. And you people today are in the same situation. The tools are different, but you are here fighting for your country. But it's not just holding the line, it is to re-establish your republic and start the second American Revolution. And I'll tell you, thank you. That's what And look, I know how hard it is. I've been involved in practical politics. And I come to this country as an outsider. And everywhere I go to Tea Party groups and 912ers, they say to me, it's tough going, you know. Can we do this thing? Nobody's listening. Nobody cares. The country's going down the Googler and we're struggling away here and nothing's happening. And I say to you, as an outsider, I've looked what you people have done in 2 or 3 years, most of you political novices, and what you've done. You stalled a short, slam-dunk movement to destroy your country and stopped it stone cold dead. And right now the left think you've gone away because you're not marching like you used to. But now you're in the county commissions. You're rolling back Agenda 21. You're priming out rhinos like Dick Lugar. Yeah. He wasn't a rhino, he was a traitor. Yeah. You know, you're getting into the school boards. You're altering the Republican Party. You are altering the character of the political debate in this country in ways you cannot imagine. But what you're doing now is going to have implications for decades. And I'll tell you, you are not alone. You think you're alone here, but there are millions of people around this planet who are watching what you're doing and they are rooting for you. Absolutely. You think the world is full of anti-Americans, and there are people like that out there, but the world is full of people too who love liberty and look to the American Constitution as the greatest political document ever written. And they look to you people as the guardians of that Constitution. And we know that if you can take back your country, keep the faith and take back your country, we can do that in our country. So it won't be just a revolution here, it's going to be revolutions for liberty all over the planet. So there are big implications of what you guys are doing. And I know that when you're in a movement, you don't know about it. You know, you're in it, you're doing the hard graft, you don't see the bigger picture sometimes. You don't see the historical implications. And sometimes it takes an outsider to look in and say, this is what's happening. And I see that as, you know, I can play a little role there. But if you don't think what you're doing is historic and important, you just cast your mind 200 years in the future. This will happen many times. There'll be some kid who will get up in front of a civics class, some teenager, and he'll be real proud, he or she, and they'll say to the classmates, look, I did some historical research, and guess what? My great-great-great-great-grandma and granddad, they were 912ers. They were the Tea Party. You know? And look how cool is that, you know? When our country, back in the 2010s, when our country was facing annihilation, they stood up and they took the country back and they started that revolution, and we're rich and prosperous and free today because of what they did back then. You know? And can you think of anything cooler to be part of than that? Can you think of, you've got 3 or 4 months to the election in front of you, can you think of any time in your life where 3 or 4 months of hard work is going to pay off more for your grandchildren than the next 3 or 4 months? Can you think of it? So how cool is that? You're part of this movement and you've got an opportunity right now in front of you to alter this country for generations to come, to give your great-great-great-grandchildren the best country in the world. You know, how cool is that? So that is what I'm here to say, ladies and gentlemen. This is the opportunity here in front of you now. And you are doing the right stuff. You're doing the right things, just a little bit more, and you're going to win this thing. So I just want to say to you guys, thank you very much for what you're doing. It's wonderful, and God bless America.